This is part one of a two-part series on eugenics, white supremacy, and U.S. immigration. In part one, we are going to examine the origins of race, according to Robert Wald Sussman, an anthropologist. We're going to examine how race evolved, not as a scientific fact, but rather a social tool used to justify the exploitation of black and brown people. And then we're also going to look at how in the first half of the 20th century, this ideology of race, in particular polygenism, turns into eugenics and some of the most strictest U.S. immigration laws in this country's history. We will also examine the human cost of this race-based U.S. immigration law and its legacies. In part two, we're going to pick it up from 1945 to the present day and examine how, despite eugenics not being as popular in mainstream science, still trying to make a comeback in the form of immigration reform in the United States. So welcome. I'm happy to have you and enjoy the podcast. Hey everyone. I wanted to make a podcast about immigration and its history in the 20th and 21st century in terms of race. So the reason why I was inspired to make this podcast came from a place of frustration. Immigration is an issue in the United States that is very controversial. Many people are very passionate about this and have been forming their own opinions and leading online discussions about what to do with the issues on the border in the South. And one thing that I've found missing in a lot of these debates and conversations is history. And history is such an important tool that every voter in a democratic nation should have in his or her pocket. Because history is a blueprint for the world we live in today. It's how we got here. And when we talk about immigration, we've tried everything. Our history is there. It's very clear. And when we're talking about facts, give me statistics, right? History has that information for you. And it's the responsibility of every voter and every citizen or non-citizen to absorb this information and receive the tools of history, the information, the facts, the content, and you can make of it what you will. But given the current climate, I think a history of U.S. immigration in terms of race from the 20th century to the present is a very important tool to have. So in order to, just before we go forward logistically, I want to credit anthropologist Robert Wald Sussman. Without his tireless research that he compiled into his book, The Myth of Race, this podcast wouldn't be possible. Virtually all of the information I'm going to give you comes from the various chapters of his academic work here. Now, I'm not going into everything that he's presenting because I think it is a very valuable tool for you to have as well. So please, I urge you to purchase this book and read it or listen to it if you like audiobooks, because it does give a very detailed history of how race as an idea was formed and perpetuated since the 1500s. So it's a tell-all book. I really suggest you do it. But we're going to focus on the 20th and 21st century and immigration. So maybe after this video, after this podcast, given the history, you might be able to formulate your opinion and become a little bit more informed with historical context in terms of the immigration debate. So sit back and let's get to this. Let's go. So in order to go into immigration, we need to view the history of race. and how it started as an ideology and how it progressed, because the ideology of race, and I use the word ideology because race is a construct. Anthropologists all over the United States and the world agree on this. Race is not a biological fixation. Race is a social construct used to incorporate, human variation into social structures of societies. And the context of race began during the era of colonization, when white Europeans came to the Americas and colonized it and used black and brown people to as pawns to build the state up. So we're talking about the era of colonization, a very strict social hierarchy, and race developed in that context. So when Europeans were planting cash crops in the colonies in Virginia or Mexico or South America, we start to see the stratification of labor fall along color and racial lines. And that's where the term race began. Okay, so race is a justification for the exploitation of black and brown people. That is a very important first step when we talk about race. The earliest justification for the exploitation of black and brown people for race comes in the definition of monogenism. So we have to remember that this was a phenomenon during the colonization of the Americas. And in the 15, 16, and 1700s, the church was very influential for Europeans and the Bible and religion. And yes, I know the Enlightenment was there and science was the scientific method was growing and we saw more reason than religion, but in reality, religion still played a major role in how Europeans justified the world they lived in at the time. So the first explanation of human variation and race, as they call it, is monogenism. Monogenism is the belief that using the Bible with Adam during the creation myth. So think back to, the book of Genesis when humanity was created in that Judeo-Christian tradition. Okay? When man was first created by God, Adam, and Adam and his descendants spread all over the earth. Monogenism is the argument that the reason why we see differences in color, where some people are black and brown and others are white, is because we're all related to Adam. God created everyone. However, the environments that all of us traveled to changed our skin. Monogenism also came in the form of characters. So we had some early philosophers argue that people of color, black and brown, were punished by God, are people of Ham. Yes, they are related to Adam, but they have strayed from the path of righteousness, so they've been cursed with dark skin. We've also seen other explanations of, for Native Americans, for instance, on why they're different than whites, is that they were one of the tribes of Israel who came to the Americas and settled here and changed the color of their skin to the environment. So really monogenism was like the belief that, yeah, all humans, no matter what color you are created by God and related to Adam. However, the darker races, well, they fell out of God's favor, whether it's environment or moral character, and the white person is the closest link to the original Adam we have. Therefore, that's why we have the superiority of whites. And that's another thing, too. With race, white supremacy and white superiority was always at the top of the hierarchy. You could not have whiteness without anti-blackness. Whiteness, whenever it was mentioned historically and justified historically, has always been done so on the backs of black and brown people. The dehumanity or dehumanization of black and brown people justifies white superiority in this context. So monogenism used the Bible to do that. And you have people like Montesquieu, Carl Linnaeus, and all of these big leaders believing in monogenism. And monogenism, because of its connection to the Bible, was very popular at the beginning of the Age of Exploration in the 1500s, and it still remained popular up until the 1700s. However, all of that changed when we entered the Enlightenment and especially the 1800s. As soon as we reach the 19th century, monogenism loses its popularity, and it is replaced with another very damaging and harmful interpretation of race and justification for why people are different. This belief is called polygenism. Polygenism is the theory that people of color were not created by God and are not descended from Adam and Eve. In fact, polygenism argues that people of color, or non-whites, are not the fullest form of the evolved human at all. Rather, polygenism suggests that they are different species. They have a different gene pool and a different blood. And one of the earliest believers of polygenism was a Jewish Spaniard named La Perriere. I might have butchered that name, but he was born in 1596. He died in 1676. And his belief was very unpopular because it went against the Bible. He believed that there were millions of people alive before Adam and Eve. And before Adam and Eve, these people were miserable. So God made Adam to save the world. And that strain of Adam is the origin story of white people. So he's saying that really white people are the closest to God, and people of color predate this and lived in a miserable world. So it kind of goes to show that they were inferior in this belief system. However, La Perriere, his works were criticized by the church, and he was labeled a heretic. It was very unpopular at the time. But his theory gained a lot of traction by Enlightenment thinkers in the 1700s who didn't take the Bible literally. And especially, this polygenism theory was evolved in the later 19th and 20th centuries. So the next big polygenic thinker was David Hume, a very well-known figure in the Western world. He's a historian and a philosopher, an Enlightenment philosopher. Born 1711, he died in 1776. He believed that non-whites were a separate species and inferior because they had, quote, no civilization, end quote, in history. The reasoning was popular. So this was a popular belief among polygenism and followers of it, but it was founded only on historical inductive reasoning, not science. So it's very important to be aware of that all of this is not scientific. It's just this man's bias. David Hume was a European. He was white. He was socialized in a colonial world where whiteness was held as the superior race, and where we see people of color in the Americas enslaved without access to education or opportunities that white people have. So David Hume, growing up in this context, saw people of color in slavery and assumed, using his historic inductive reasoning, that, well, they're inherently inferior because they're inherently uncivilized. So this polygenism, where non-whites are seen as separate species incapable of civilization, is founded not in science at all. It's just founded in the opinions of someone socialized in a white supremacist society. But then David Hume's ideas are evolved by Immanuel Kant. Now, Kant is another very important Enlightenment philosopher. In fact, he is considered the father of anthropology. And Kant's belief in polygenism was the standard norm for the explanation of race and how anthropology was mainstream all the way up until 1945. Isn't that scary just to think that this guy's ideas and this guy's beliefs on race persisted that long? So it's pretty important to understand what those were, because that determined what the science of the time was. And that science is what justified the horrible institutions of slavery and Jim Crow. So what did he believe? What was his version of polygenism? Well, he believed that God created different races. In fact, 4 races. He believed that the climate made them inferior, the people of color inferior, and that people of color cannot change races using climate. He said that all people were created by God, and God put these people in different climates, and climate created their inferiority, and this cannot be unchanged. Therefore, there is no hope, in his terms, of civilizing a person of color or turning them, and that's what I mean when I use the word civilize in this context, it's turning them white. So Kant believed that you can't do that. And he said the nature of the white race guarantees highest moral order in whites. Non-whites don't have the reason, moral, or rationality, and color proves this. And he argued that color is a physical symptom of inferiority. So this troubling belief that Kant has been perpetuating since the 1770s in European anthropology is that morality only applies to white people and people of color are inherently lesser. And in his writings, he talks specifically about how to punish people of color, and he goes into gruesome details about even how to physically punish people of color who are not acting or disobeying whites. So you could see that race as a scientific belief, a justification, right, is specifically being used to dehumanize black and brown people and justify their position in the stratification of labor, that they are slaves and they are at the lowest rung of the social order and they belong there. So that's what Kant argued. And how did he come to this belief? Right? Well, first of all of his terms are based off of objective reasoning. Just like David Hume, Immanuel Kant grew up in Western society in a colonial world where he was socialized in a society that perpetuated the idea that whiteness was greatness, whiteness is superior. So believing this, that skewed his line of reasoning when studying people of color, and automatically using his objective reasoning made them seem inferior. And he codified that. He also talked about how Jews were subhuman because their religion promotes materialism and that it is an obstacle to morality. Now, that is not founded in any scientific reasoning whatsoever. Yet it became science. So we're seeing the justification for the exploitation of black and brown people and also Jews. We're seeing the justification for that using this non-scientific science that's really based on racism, anti-Semitism, that comes from socialization in a white supremacist society. So Kant taught these ideas for 40 years, from 1756 to 1797, and he was well known and respected. So Kant, in fact, is one of the most important Western theorists. He set the foundation for the division between the Herrenvolk, or people, versus the Untermenschen, the subhumans. Yeah, you heard that right. Kant was the person who coined the term Untermenschen, which will be used by the Nazis. See, the reason why we're going this far back is because the science, quote unquote, that's used to justify immigration later in the United States was the same science used by the Nazis to carry out the rise of fascism and the Holocaust. So it's really important that we go back this far because that's how historically connected this idea of race is. So we went from Lapierre to David Hume to Immanuel Kant. Now we have Dr. Samuel Morton. We have entered the 19th century, the 1800s. The United States is an independent country by this time. So, what was the science around race at this era? It was still polygenism. Dr. Samuel Morton was an American doctor in the 1830s who founded the idea of Mortonism. This was the belief of, measuring cranial capacity and skull shape and skull size to trace your ancestors back to, well, white, black, or brown people. And he said physical differences are shaped by your skull size. And yeah, this was not done in any scientific manner at all, but yet you could kind of see this trend of polygenism, right? That like black and brown people cannot be saved because they are biologically wired to be quote unquote inferior. That's why we have Dr. Samuel Morton measuring people's skull sizes, saying, well, if you're born with this skull, you are not as superior as the white race. So we have this guy measuring skulls, but later on in the mid 19th century, around the era of the Civil War, we see Josiah Nott. He was born in 1804, he died in 1873, but he was a follower of Kant's anthropology and a spokesman for the American School of Anthropology. Talking about his socialization and his background, he came from a slaveholding family in South Carolina, and he carried innate prejudice from being raised in that slave culture, and that helped him convince himself that Kant's teachings about the inferiority of the African were scientific proof, because all Josiah had to do was look outside and see, well, it looks like the black and brown people are in chains and not the whites. So, using this biased, racist interpretation of human variation derived from socialization in a white supremacist society, he starts giving lectures and he's defending the belief that Caucasians were descended from Adam and other races were not equal because they are not descended from Adam. Dr. Morton loved him, and they worked together in forming American racial science in the mid 19th century. So it's very important to understand, like, that is the formation of race scientifically in the United States. And those ideologies, those published works, were always cited to justify slavery. The reason why we see black and brown people being enslaved in the United States, if there were any moral questions about it, well, all you had to do if you were white and unsure is, hey, well, according to Josiah Nott or Dr. Samuel Morton, uh, they're born that way. They are inferior. So could you see how troubling this science is? So really, polygenism becomes very popular after Charles Darwin does his thing in the 1850s, right? The idea of evolution. That really propels polygenic thinking that, well, maybe, there are different variations of humans and different races, and, some races are evolved over others. So we start to see the idea of not all people are created equal turn into a story of evolution. As some might argue, social Darwinism. That becomes the new trend of racial science in the late 19th century in the United States. Charles Galton, actually a relative of Charles Darwin, took Charles Darwin's thinking and applied it to human beings. So that's where we see Charles Darwin's, social Darwinism ideology come. But this polygenism becomes very popular in Europe. And we have a quote unquote scientist named Joseph Arthur Gobineau. He was born in 1816, 1882. So he is from France. He is considered the grandfather of modern academic racism. So he was alive when, Charles Darwin's theory of polygenism was very popular. He saw the end of monogenism, where, all men are created by God and descended from Adam. Yeah, that's not in vogue anymore because of Charles Darwin. Gobineau did research when I say research, he read the works of Immanuel Kant and Josiah Nott and all that. And he argued that there were four types of races, and even among whites, there were sub races: Nordics, Alpines, and Mediterraneans. And at the very top, the best of the best and most evolved form of human, are Aryans. And this term Aryan is going to be very important later on in history when we talk about the rise of the Nazis, because this version of humanity is what the Nazis strived to emulate in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, so much so that it was the driving force behind the Holocaust. So it's important to understand that, the Holocaust and racism isn't just done by these crazy people like Hitler. This is something that has been codified in education and science way back in the 19th century. So Gobineau is the one who really wrote about Aryans and mentioned how blood and heredity determines character, not biblical separation. Once the blood is tainted, it is unfixable. So we start to see the idea of the glass of water. So I have a glass of water here, and I'm looking at it. Um, if you were a polygenist who follows Gobineau's writings, you would believe that race and your bloodline and your genetics are a glass of water if you're an Aryan. It's pure. It's the ultimate form of humanity. It's perfect. But as soon as you start mixing your genes with those of lesser blood, those of quote unquote inferior blood, or the germ plasm, yeah, they actually use that word, the germ plasm, like someone's genetics are germs, they're that inferior. If you put even one drop of a germ plasm in this pure glass of water, oh, it's tainted. So Gobineau is saying that Aryans are the purest of the pure, and we need to preserve the Aryan blood in order to create the most evolved and civilized form of humanity. So this even became more popularized by popular culture in Germany in the 19th century because Wagner, that famous composer, bought into the superiority of the German Aryan blood, of the German Volk. So now, in this era of scientific racism, we're talking like the late 1800s, we're seeing white people and white Europeans justify their superiority on a biological level, on a fixed biological level. That, well, you see, these brown and black people can't fix their issues because they are born inferior. So there is no use in helping them or civilizing them. And it's very important to understand that this is not science. In fact, and this is a trend that we've always been talking about here, a social tool used to justify a system of hierarchical labor. What that means is a white society using black and brown people and exploiting them for their labor. That's really what this race science is for. And when anyone asks, "Hey, why are black and brown people always forced to endure these conditions?" Well, there's your science. That's what's being used. Okay, and it's not science, but nonetheless, that is it. So now let's go back to the United States. We're going to talk about a guy named Nathaniel Schaller. Now, he went to Harvard and he studied Gobineau's ideas. So he was heavily influenced by Gobineau's idea of the pure Aryan and that glass of water germplasm myth that you need to preserve the white race. So Nathaniel Schaller of Harvard got a job at Harvard and he taught those ideas to over 7,000 students by the turn of the 20th century. And when you think of Harvard, that's like the best of the best, the elites. You don't question what's being studied there because that's fact. That's the most progressive form of education. So could you see how these ideas are so institutionalized? That's what we mean by institutional racism. Like it's so embedded in the power structures and the institutions of this nation. So Anyway, we're seeing Nathaniel Schaller teaching Gobineau's Aryan ideas to 7,000 mostly American students. And I mean white Americans. So Gobineau codified the superiority of Aryans, and Schaller was teaching it. So one of Schaller's students in the turn of the 20th century was a man named Charles Davenport. Davenport is going to be a very important figure in United States history when we talk about eugenics, because Davenport is going to be the one who forms the Eugenics Records Office in the United States to help change legislation for immigration. So let's talk about what eugenics is, because now we're going to talk about eugenics. All right? Eugenics is the practice of preventing, quote unquote, undesirable traits from being passed to a future generation by preventing those with those traits from reproducing with each other. Eugenics is also the push to improve a gene pool by looking at someone with the quote unquote positive traits and having those people reproduce and make more children. So, really, it's controlling reproduction. Farmers do it with their cows and livestock. But now, because of the white supremacist version of racial science that developed through polygenism in the 19th century, we're seeing the same process that's done to cattle now being done to human beings. White people who are considered to be Aryans are going to be pressured to reproduce with each other and make as many children as possible to preserve the gene pool. Meanwhile, black and brown people who have been taught through scientific racism that they have inferior traits and inferior genes and the germ plasm, they're going to either be sterilized, sent away, or forced not to reproduce. So eugenics is going to be the social policy of the United States when we talk about academia and science. It is a very dangerous ideology that will lead to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. And the reason why we need to talk about eugenics is because with race, it has its foundations in this idea of white supremacy, and eugenics has been used to change US immigration law. So let's talk about how eugenics first showed itself in the United States in the 20th century. There were two forms of eugenics: positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics was popular in Europe. It was the control of human breeding to make a superior race. So convincing Aryans to make more children and paying those with lesser non-Aryan traits to not have babies. So that's the positive form of eugenics. The negative form is destroying the undesirable races by segregation, deportation, sterilization, passive euthanasia, and ultimately extermination. Negative eugenics is what is popular in the United States. So the reason why negative eugenics wasn't as popular in Europe at the turn of the 1900s is because Europe was mostly ethnically homogeneous, which means mostly white. There was not a lot of diversity color-wise in Europe. So really a lot of the issues like alcoholism, opium addiction, and class poverty, things that are attributed as the negative germplasm, the bad traits of the lesser races, that was more attributed to class. Like, oh, poor people, that's a race. But in the United States, we here in the United States, where I'm recording, by the 1900s, is a very diverse country when we talk about color. We have people of white. We have Southern Europeans. We have Southeastern Europeans. We have Jews, because of the diaspora of Africa or Africans in West Africa, we have many black and brown people, we have Hispanics. So the United States was not homogeneous. It still had a white majority, but nonetheless, there was this push and desire to really segregate the races in the United States because if we're following Gobineau and Schaller and Davenport's polygenism, one drop of that inferior germplasm will taint the whole body. So it's best to take this negative eugenic action and segregate the races to protect the whites. And that was the science of the era. So, in the early 1900s, negative eugenics wasn't as successful because negative eugenics is talking about forced sterilizations of people of color and forced castrations, which really wasn't a popular thing. Woodrow Wilson, who was a legislator, helped Indiana adopt legislation that made sterilization of undesirables compulsory. He will later become the president of the United States 10 years later. Well, not even 10 years, but nonetheless, it still wasn't that popular. The United States was not about forced sterilization. New York, New Jersey, Nevada, and many other states did not have these eugenic laws. So these early white supremacist eugenic scientists had a big problem on their hands. They were afraid of an Armageddon, of the Aryan race, the white race, being wiped out from race mixing. And the US government was not doing anything about it in their heads. So we start to see these eugenic scientists pressure the US government to take actions to ensure that the white race is protected. And Charles Davenport, that student of Nathaniel Schaller, is going to be very instrumental in that. Charles Davenport was able to gain the support of industrialist and millionaire Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie gave Davenport a financial grant to start the ERO, or the Eugenics Records Office. So Davenport used his Harvard education to justify the ERO. He basically told Andrew Carnegie, the white race is in trouble, and we have the ultimate science of anthropology to prove it, so we need funding in order to preserve the white race. So the ERO's job was to collect data on the ancestry of the US population and educate white Americans about racial hygiene. And when we talk about racial hygiene, think about that germplasm, right? The whole idea of Gobineau, don't mix with quote unquote lesser races. So the lack of success of the ERO and eugenics changed in 1912. 1912 is going to be a turning point year when we talk about science and race and all that, because in 1912, the first International Eugenics Congress was formed in London. So all these well-known European anthropologists and American anthropologists from Harvard and all these schools, Princeton, were invited to come to learn about eugenics. And with pressure from industrialists and American scientists, the US government supported this Congress. And why did they do it? Well, many of the most advanced nations in the world, and I used advanced because those who had the power at the time, England, France, all these countries with colonies all over Africa and reaping the wealth and riches of colonization and imperialism. Eugenics was in vogue. This was the science of the time. So the United States wanted to catch up and be a part of this move and what they call progress and mutual learning. Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson all supported this eugenics council, as well as U.S. businessmen and women, industrialists, eager to be in vogue and catch up with European science. Because remember, Gobineau was a French eugenics scientist, so they wanted to catch up. So Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Henry Ford, J.H. Kellogg, C.J. Gamble, and Mrs. H.B. DuPont all pledged support to Davenport's ERO to help make federal changes in favor of eugenics. So after this International Congress, all of the people with the power in the United States, the wealthy industrialists and politicians, realized we really need to make a change. We need to preserve the white race, or else the white race will be wiped out by the germplasm. In 1913, previous President Teddy Roosevelt wrote to Davenport saying, quote, "Society has no business to permit degenerates to reproduce their kind." He continues to say, quote, "Farmers breed their cattle, but we reproduce with degenerates." End quote. Roosevelt continued that it's an, quote, "inescapable duty of the good citizen to leave their blood behind him in the world." End quote. So when we talk about like Teddy Roosevelt and other well-renowned U.S. politicians that we romanticize and look up to, they are in favor of this idea of eugenics. So let's explore what happened in that 1912 Congress. What was so convincing? So there was an agenda. There were 4 points at the International Eugenics Conference and Congress that all the powers that be agreed to work on. They had 4 goals. Goal number 1 was selective breeding. Goal number 2 was the sterilization of the unfit. Goal 3 was intelligence testing or IQ testing of the unfit to examine intelligence of the races. And then goal number 4, and this is relevant to our topic in the video here, limiting immigration from various ethnic groups. We're going to go over each of these 4 things and how the United States carried them out. So Rockefeller funded the Advisory Council for the Eugenics Society in the United States, and their goal was to prevent race suicide and indiscriminate migration. Rather, indiscriminate immigration. So wealthy industrialists were all about preventing immigration from countries where the germplasm existed in their mind. So let's talk about goal number 1, selective breeding. So selective breeding is that push to convince white Americans to not mix with people of color. Because remember Gobineau's idea of the germplasm in that glass of water. You don't want that one drop of the germplasm to taint the pure gene pool. So, because they believe that like negative traits and genes such as laziness or alcoholism or low intelligence were inheritable traits like genetics. So in order to prevent getting those horrible traits, they promoted selective breeding. So only breed with white people if you are white. And if you are not white, don't breed at all. So intermarriage laws were passed in the United States because they were justified, quote unquote, justified by racial science promoted by Gobineau, Nathan Schaller. All right. So Davenport praised Germany's efforts in preserving Aryan blood. Back in 1917, Germany paid Aryan men cash to reproduce with volunteer Aryan women in 1917 to, replace the war dead, because World War I was going on at this time. So Davenport was saying, look, Germany's doing great with selective breeding. They're ensuring that Aryans are mixing with Aryans. In the United States, better baby contests were popular at state fairs all across the United States, and they were held by the American Eugenics Society. We also saw fitter family contests, which is basically like, imagine going to the state fair and enrolling your family to be examined by doctors to determine if you come from strong Aryan stock. And I think this quote that I'm about to read from Mary Watts, the American Eugenics Society chairman, will kind of characterize what the fitter families contests were all about. Quote, while the stock judges are testing the Holsteins, Jerseys, and Whitefaces in the stock pavilion, we are judging the Joneses, the Smiths, the Johnsons, and everyone replies, I think it's about time people had a little of the attention that is given to animals. End quote. The winners of these fitter family contests would get bronze medals with AES inscribed on them, American Eugenics Society. And this was a privilege that white people enjoyed, right? Because it's all about preserving the white breed. So again, selective breeding. These are things that the United States is doing, like a propaganda campaign to convince white Americans to be fit, be racially hygienic, and don't mix with those of lesser blood. Don't mix with black or brown people. So Alexander Graham Bell, yeah, him, the guy who invented the telephone, he was the chairman of Davenport's ERO, the Eugenics Records Office. He suggested to the U.S. government that for the 1920 census, they should include the names of parents for each citizen. So in that way, the ERO could trace the pedigree of every American citizen in the country. So again, this is a step for codifying racial pedigrees, similar to what Nazi Germany is about to do in a few decades, to see who's white, who's not. And thankfully, the Census Bureau are one of the only federal institutions that challenged the ERO and said no. Well, they agreed to Alexander Graham Bell's proposition. Yes, all citizens had to put their parents' names on the census. However, the census refused to allow Harry H. Laughlin, another ERO anthropologist. They refused him to categorize asylum inmates as socially unfit. So, there was some opposition, which is good. However, nonetheless, there was a lot of support for eugenics, a lot of support for pushing the ideas of breeding and selective breeding, rather. Another thing that was done in the United States to preserve selective breeding, the 1912 Eugenics Council plan, was the Racial Integrity Act. So Virginia had a Racial Integrity Act passed in 1924. And this act remained in the books in the state of Virginia until 1966. Supported by ERO research from Charles Davenport, Virginians had to register their race with the state, and incorrect claims could land you in prison for up to 5 years. The Journal of Public Health in 1925, which was a publication, scientific publication supported by the Eugenics Records Office, the ERO, this journal said, quote, the most perfect expression of the white ideal and the most important effort made in the past 4,000 years, end quote, when talking about this Racial Integrity Act. So that's selective breeding. So now the second goal of the Eugenics Congress in 1912 was about the sterilization of the unfit. What are you going to do to all of the non-Aryans, the non-whites, the black and brown peoples, the Jews who are classified by anthropology and white science at the time to be unfit, infected with the germplasm, sick, degenerate? What are we to do about them? Well, the International Eugenics Council said they should be sterilized. So the United States, using the help of wealthy white industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and all of them, convinced the U.S. government to work on this, to work on incorporating sterilization. So remember, this idea of sterilizing unfit people was very unpopular. Remember, Woodrow Wilson tried to do it in 1907 in Indiana? He was successful there, but really he was a minority. Most Americans were against this idea because it was so undemocratic, so wrong. And this frustrated Harry H. Laughlin. Now remember, Harry H. Laughlin is a member of the Eugenics Society, the ERO. And in 1914, he was really upset by this. In 1914, Laughlin wrote, quote, "Unless all states cooperate in the purging of the blood of the American people of its bad strains, we should not expect the program to work out as calculated." End quote. Over time, however, using the wealth from his patrons, he was able to help convince the US government to pass sterilization laws on a state level. California listened to him. California carried out 80% of national sterilizations of the unfit, quote unquote, in 1922. And it's important to characterize what they mean by unfit. Yes, unfit falls along racial terms in the United States, so people of color were classified in this racist system as unfit, but also those with mental illnesses and disabilities. That was considered unfit. But also, it's important to note that unfitness was classified very broadly, and it specifically targeted women. For example, the superintendent of Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded persons, named Albert Priddy, allowed inmates to be sterilized before they were discharged. And in order to qualify for this forced sterilization, you had to either be, quote, alcoholic, weak-minded, wayward, homosexual, immoral, insane, feeble-minded, backward, untruthful, defective, incorrigible, illegitimate, criminal, or oversexed. End quote. So all of these were classified by the elite white American scientists as unfit. These are examples of the germplasm. They don't have the pure glass of water Aryan blood that Gobineau and Nathaniel Schaller and Davenport talk about. In fact, they're just tainted. So they were forcefully sterilized in Virginia. Famously, a Supreme Court case called Buck versus Bell in 1927 ruled that forced sterilization, was unpopular but lawful. The opinion was written by Holmes, who was a justice on the Supreme Court, and he wrote in 1927 about the case, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for a crime, or letting them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." End quote. So after the US Supreme Court justified the sterilization of the unfit, or those with the germplasm or non-Aryan blood, by 1930, sterilization is accepted widespread in the United States. 30 US states had forced sterilization laws. From 1927 to 1930, in fact, 36,000 people were sterilized and their property was taken by state governments. That was the farthest the United States ever got with forced sterilization. Nazi Germany was the only country to exterminate people that were unfit with the germplasm. So, going back to 1912, the International Eugenics Congress had a third goal that these quote-unquote white nations, these Aryan nations, needed to carry out. And that third goal was intelligence testing, or IQ testing. So Gobineau, that French scientist that we keep mentioning who invented the term Aryan, wrote in his book, SI, that intelligence must be measured not by individuals, but by race. He said this because there were many people in the United States and Europe that would say, yeah, you can't say every person of color is dumb because my friend is very smart. There's this one individual, African American woman or man that is intelligent and went to school and scored higher than white kids. And in many cases, yes, intelligence is not tied to color of your skin. So of course you're going to have very intelligent people from all colors. Yet Gobineau specifically divorced intelligence from the individual and brought it back to race and said, yeah, there might be some, but nope, we got to measure the intelligence of the different races to prove that, yep, there is no use in saving those who are infected with the germplasm. So with Gobineau's guidance about wanting to quantify intelligence to prove that the quote-unquote inferior races are proven to have low intelligence, a framework, a test was needed to do this. How are you going to prove on a numerical level that people of color and Jews are mentally and intellectually inferior to white Aryans? So the closest framework that the ERO had at its disposal was a psychological test made by Alfred Binet. Now, Binet, born 1857, he died in 1911. He was a famous psychologist who developed an intelligence test to help quantify the skill level of students who need special services in schools. It was a very progressive idea, but once Binet died in 1911, the ERO used his test but turned it racial. An ERO-funded scientist named Henry H. Goddard conducted biased and unscientific intelligence tests using Binet's model at Ellis Island. Now, one of the qualifiers for intelligence was the ability to comprehend and speak English, which is a pretty biased thing to put in an intelligence test. So what Goddard did was he went to Ellis Island in like 1911, 1912, and interviewed immigrants. And his results were the following. 87% of Russians, and Russians was a code word for Jews at the time because of the pogroms. Many Russians happened to be Jews. 87% of them were considered feeble-minded. 80% of all Hungarians that came into Ellis Island are feeble-minded. 79% of all Italians were considered feeble-minded, according to Goddard. And this was given scientific accreditation by wealthy industrialists, and his work was published with funding from wealthy industrialists and by the ERO. And keep that in mind, because we're talking about immigration here, and this is where the early tests emerged. So Goddard's study was posted in Madison Grant's pro-eugenics 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race. And yeah, guys, we're going to need to talk about the passing of the great race for a minute. I know we're going to kind of take a little detour from intelligence testings, but this book is going to be instrumental in the eugenics movement and in the Holocaust. So Madison Grant was a zoologist. That was his background. He wasn't a scientist of human variation. He was a zoologist. He studied animals. And he opposed democracy because he believed that it gave feeble-minded people a voice in destroying the Nordic race. He feared that they will be outvoted, that white people would be outvoted by those who are feeble-minded. So he demanded a society that did not have that. So Grant was the founder of the New York Zoological Society. He helped start the Bronx Zoo in the United States, which in 1906 had a Congolese man named Ota Benga on display in a monkey cage in 1906. Yeah, he was behind that. So we're talking about a man who believes firmly that those who are not belonging to the white race have more in common with animals rather than human beings, because that's what polygenism teaches, especially after social Darwinism in the 1800s. So yeah, that's a really shameful moment in history. And the Bronx Zoo, even to this day, does not even recognize Otabenga's existence there. They actually label him as an employee at the zoo rather than someone who was put on display in a monkey cage, which talks about the institutional racism that still lingers today from this time period. Nonetheless, Madison Grant was not a scientist at all, but he gained his knowledge from eugenicists, especially Henry Fairfield, who was the president of the Museum of Natural History. And yeah, you heard that, the Museum of Natural History in New York City, that was a big center for eugenics research at the time. Ota Benga, that same man who was on display at the Bronx Zoo, was also on display as an exhibit at the Museum of Natural History. So Madison Grant published this book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. And before we get into the thesis of this book that's so important to eugenics and immigration later, we need to look at the historical context. So in 1916, immigration was huge in the United States, and in particular in New York City. 1.4 of New York's 1.8 million population had one foreign-born parent. And Grant was wary about this. Grant was really nervous that the white race would be outbred and outvoted by people with the germplasm. He often said that Rome fell to degenerate races, and so will the United States. So something needed to be done. So in his 1916 book, he challenged the idea of diversity. And by the way, the book, The Passing of the Great Race, that we're talking about, Hitler considered it his personal Bible, Adolf Hitler. So this book, written by an American, is embraced by Adolf Hitler, which will be later used in the Holocaust. So the methodology of this book, the science and the scientific method, which was non-existent in his case, but Madison Grant used Hume's 1740s claims. So remember Hume, that old philosopher from the 1700s? He kind of resurged the idea that he proclaimed that Africans had no civilization, and he used that to prove that after all this time, people of color still don't change and they're inherently inferior. So mixing with them will ruin the white race. Which again, that is not founded in any science whatsoever. It's created in the context of a white supremacist social hierarchy, and it's conjured up to justify the exploitation of non-whites. So he also uses Gobineau's Nordicism and Aryan beliefs, as well as Davenport's breeding and selective breeding ideas. So this book, 1916's The Passing of the Great Race, is like an amalgamation of all of the eugenics and polygenism ideas, all in one solid book. So this book warned that immigration would lead to Aryans being outnumbered. So this book was specifically saying, if we keep letting people from non-civilized countries and low intelligence countries into the United States, our country and our civilization is going to fall. And when he says "our," he really means white. So white civilization will fall if we keep open borders, if we keep allowing these people from Europe and Asia from swarming into our country. So he says, what do we do? The book talks about, well, his book says that, we need to separate from the inferior races because, well, we can't save them. They're intellectually and fixed to be inferior, so they can't be saved. That's really what it was, just separate. It was a segregation book. And Hitler later interpreted that message to extermination. Exterminate the undesirables to save Germany. So this single book was used to justify human rights abuses from Jim Crow to the Holocaust, all the way up until the end of the civil rights movement in the United States. And this book was very popular in the United States. Writings and snippets from the book and quotes from the book were often found in Ku Klux Klan pamphlets, women's magazines, Margaret Sanger's birth control review, and it was peppered all throughout Mein Kampf. In the notes section of Mein Kampf, we see Madison Grant's book cited heavily. And Madison Grant, where did he get all of his citations? Where did he get all of his work? He got it from all of these unscientific studies done from these IQ tests on Ellis Island, which were not scientific at all. So let's go back to those tests, those IQ tests, because that was one of the things that the Eugenics Council and Congress worked on. They wanted to quantify put a number to the intellectual capabilities of the inferior races. So what was done here is in 1917, a study funded by the ERO, the Eugenics Society, a study by Terman, Goddard, and Yerkes was done on U.S. soldiers. So remember, it's 1917. World War I's going on. We see the United States Army is segregated at the time, but the United States Army is very diverse. It's filled with your white Americans, but also with first-generation immigrants from all over the world, Asians. You also have a large number of African American soldiers in the U.S. military. So, intelligence tests were conducted on many soldiers from many different ethnic backgrounds. And these tests were culturally biased and unscientific. There was the alpha test, the beta test, and the Binet test that was already conducted by Goddard back in 1912. So the alpha test was an open-ended verbal exam. So just imagine, you're a U.S. soldier. First, let's just say like you're Hungarian or Italian. Pick whatever European country. You're an immigrant soldier fighting in the army. We sit down and I'm with a book and I'm about to conduct a test for you from the Eugenics Society. And these are actual questions to measure intelligence. See if you see any cultural bias here. All right? Here's a question. Quote, a pitcher is very important in which sport? Question 2. There is a reason, quote, so there is a reason, is an ad for what product? Question 3. What is a first-class batting average? Question 4. What is the occupation of Jess Willard? So, answering these questions in the 21st century, I can only answer one. A pitcher is important in baseball. But I don't know who Jess Willard is or what a first-class batting average is. Do you see how the questions of this test are culturally biased? They're fitting an American, and in particular a white American vision of culture, and that's how they're measuring intelligence. So Jess Willard is this famous white boxer in the United States. So imagine being an immigrant from Italy. You don't know who Jess Willard is, or you don't play baseball back in Sicily. Like, what does a batting average even mean? Does that mean they're intellectually inferior? No, of course not. It just means that they're not familiar with the U.S. environment, U.S. culture. U.S. culture, which is infused with white supremacy in this time. That is what they're being tested on. So the beta test is for those who didn't speak English. It was a test with pictures, images, pictures that had missing elements on them. So the person would be showed an image and they must point to what is missing. So for example, one of the images on this test would be a record player without the speaker. So the person would have to tell the test giver, hey, the thing wrong with this image is there's no speaker. And they would draw it. They would be forced to draw what is missing. Also, another thing would be like a tennis match. A picture of two people playing tennis, but there's no net. Like the tennis net is missing, so they have to draw the net, right? So that is what was used to test the intelligence of people living in the United States by race. And the thing is, even for the beta test, immigrants wouldn't know what specific US sports were. Think if you're a farmer from Sicily or Hungary and you've never really seen a record player before. You're not going to write that. You're not going to identify it. Does that mean you're feeble minded? Does that mean you have low IQ? Of course not. These tests are culturally unfair and culturally biased to fit a white supremacist culture. They're not collecting evidence to determine a scientific finding. Rather, they're collecting evidence with the finding already in their mind. They already know what they're trying to do. They're trying to prove that non-whites and non-Aryans are feeble-minded. So they're going into these tests already biased. So that's why, think of today with IQ tests. The history of IQ tests have this history, how they were used to justify white supremacy and white superiority. So the test results of this 1917 U.S. Army study showed that 47% of whites in the United States were morons. 47. 87% of blacks in the United States were considered morons. Russians had the IQ average mental age of 11 years old. Same for Italians, 11 years old. Polish had 10-year-old minds, and the study conducted proved in their analysis that blacks had a mental age of 10. So all of these findings were published in a 900-page report and sent to the U.S. government to try to convince U.S. politicians that, look, the United States is in grave danger. Those with the lower races and the germplasm are going to mix and breed with our white citizens and degenerate the quality of our blood and ruin the United States. So this study, which was not founded in any science, is now being used to justify laws like the Virginia Racial Integrity Act that we just mentioned, or those forced sterilization laws. In fact, Buck versus Bell in 1927 specifically cited this 1917 Army study. So all of this should inform you that unscientific testing, already socialized with white supremacy in mind as the end goal, is being used to justify and explain white supremacy and white superiority and the exploitation of black and brown people. Finally, the last goal that the 1912 Congress had was restricting immigration. And I know we're an hour, 11 minutes in, or just about, we're over an hour in, and we're talking about immigration here. But with these quote unquote scientific racial tests done, the US government was being convinced to change their immigration laws. So there was already an American tradition of nativism ever since the country started in 1776. But now, anti-immigration was being reworked and revived by eugenics, a scientific racist ideology was now infused with anti-immigration here. And that starts the troubling historical legacy of immigration today immigration policies in the United States today. So the post-Civil War, here's some examples, right, of anti-immigration in the United States. The post-Civil War economy, so 1870s and all that, collapsed. So the United States was suffering economic collapse. So what did the United States do? They blamed the Chinese for stealing American jobs. So in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed. So there's already a history in the United States of anti-immigrant behavior and the US government taking action on that. In 1907, there was a restriction on Japanese immigration in California. And in 1917, the same year that the Army test was conducted, the Asiatic Barred Zone was created in California, banning immigrants within that zone in Asia from entering the United States, particularly California. But then after World War I, we start to see a major shift in US immigration in terms of eugenics. So, for the historical context, after World War I, the influenza pandemic ravages the United States. There is also a massive wave of immigration coming to the United States as well. Many Europeans fleeing war-torn nations after World War I. And then also, in 1918 and particularly 1919, Black Americans were fleeing racial terrorism in the South and settling in northern cities like New York. So many of the eugenics leaders, which were headquartered in New York City, like Madison Grant, the author of The Passing of the Great Race, and Charles Davenport, were anxious. They saw the United States, white United States, being invaded by immigrants and Black Americans, and a disease, influenza, killing many people. So there was this real push to prevent foreigners with the germplasm from entering the United States. The ERO, Charles Davenport's ERO, used Madison Grant's 1916 book to warn white male congressmen of the dangers of open immigration. President Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, supported the ERO and said in his campaign in the 1920s, America must be kept American, end quote. So pay attention to how you don't see the word white in there, but it's what he means. Patriotism and whiteness and white supremacy are one in the same in that statement, because that is the tactic used by eugenics and racists and white supremacists to further their agendas. So patriotism and whiteness, boom, hand in hand here. And using this tradition, we start to see the U.S. government change their minds on open borders, because up until this time, the United States was, besides Asia, of course, like what I mentioned earlier, in Europe, immigrants were being accepted in almost open borders like from all over. So the science that promoted or justified immigration restriction, eugenics, was a white male echo chamber of culturally biased testing and unscientific fear-mongering from Madison Grant's book. This is why diversity is so important. At this time, you had only white men in power, and these white men were terrified of losing their power, so they conjured up these ideas of eugenics to restrict immigration. So that's why it's so important to have diversity and various opinions from many different ethnic groups. Okay, so what did this result in? So the ERO is bombarding US congressmen with these scientific studies, which aren't scientific at all, but bombarding them. And with Congress support, the Johnson-Reed Act was signed by President Calvin Coolidge in 1924. It promoted the national quota system, which is what you see in the image of this podcast. It basically argued this and enforced this. The USA will let in 2% of the people from each country who immigrated using the 1890 census, not the 1920 census. So the reason why they're going back to 1890 is in 1890 there wasn't as massive of an immigration wave back then because the most recent census report in 1920 was very diverse. America had a lot of different ethnic backgrounds and everything. So the US government specifically chose a census from an era where there were more white people than people of color and said, okay, there was a total of 15,000 Hungarians that came into the United States. This act is saying we will only allow 2% of that number into the country. The second part of the Johnson-Reed Act was the Asia-Pacific Triangle. Any nation in a triangle drawn on the map of Asia was banned from immigrating. So these countries include Japan, China, Korea, Laos, Siam, Philippines, Burma, India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. So the unfortunate thing here is many of these areas in Asia were colonized by brutal European powers. And because of this restrictive immigration law, they were unable to immigrate to the United States. So unfortunately, many people and refugees wanting to flee these strict colonial societies were forced to remain because of the US and their restrictive immigration laws. So strict US immigration law trapped millions of people fleeing from genocidal regimes and trapped them and left them at the mercy of genocidal regimes. Because this law was passed, guys, check the year, 1924. Guys, what happens in the next 15 years in Europe? Jews were particularly targeted in this immigration quota, and many Jews were barred from entering the country. Due to the strict quota placed on Jews, many European Jews were barred from entering the United States. Essentially, when the Nazis took over the majority of Europe during World War II, many of them were trapped and murdered in the Holocaust by a regime that utilized all of the eugenic studies done in the United States. M. Viner, the author of The Global Migration Crisis in 1995, cites that 190,000 to 200,000 Jews could have been saved during the Holocaust if the United States did not have strict immigration rules. The Nazis implemented all of Charles Davenport's ERO goals with fascism because the only reason why eugenics did not take the form of extermination in the United States was because the United States was a democracy. American citizens voted against strict eugenic rules. And the ERO constantly had to convince and lobby and pay US government officials to carry out their policies. It was too slow of a process. But in Nazi Germany, there was no democracy in the 1930s. Hitler's Nazi Party enforced every US eugenic standard into law. So Nazi Germany is an example of an American science without limitation from the government. In fact, the government was enforcing this American science. And US immigration policy, which was influenced by this eugenics, led to the deaths of many thousands of Jews. The MS St. Louis was a ship that carried Jews fleeing from Europe headed to the United States on May 13th, 1939. Kristallnacht already happened at this time. Nazi Germany has already been constructing concentration camps by this date, so Jews were fleeing Nazi Germany and European states in order to come to the United States for freedom. First, the ship went to Cuba, and Cuba turned the boat away. And unfortunately, off the shores of Miami, Florida, the MS St. Louis was forced to return to Europe. U.S. immigration law denied their asylum. And it was very unfortunate for many of these Jews because these Jews had cousins and family members already living in the United States. When the U.S. had practically open borders with Europe, many Jews fled to the United States. So many of these Jews on the St. Louis had family members in the States hoping to reach them. But they were forced to turn around. And the Jews had a choice to either land in Britain, Belgium, or the Netherlands. 288 of those on board decided to go to Britain. Out of that 288, one survived. One casualty. One of the 288 died. So most of them survived if they went to Britain. However, 620 of those Jews, the ones who landed in Belgium and Netherlands, 254 of them were murdered in the Holocaust. This is just but one example. Many Jews tried to get around U.S. immigration law by obtaining fake visas in Cuba, traveling to Mexico, and crossing the southern border illegally into the United States. This was a major problem for the U.S. government and those enforcing the border in the 1920s and 1930s. So already, when we talk about the history of the border between Mexico and the United States, during the rise of the Nazi Party, the United States was not allowing Jews in the country because of the racist eugenics laws, because they believed Jews had the germplasm, recalling Immanuel Kant's anthropology back in the 1700s, that Jews were materialistic and they had the germplasm. They were not allowed, and that was the U.S. immigration policy at the time. So they illegally smuggled themselves across the southern border. Now, if that isn't a piece of history that rhymes with the current day, I don't know what is. So, eugenics was founded on unscientific ideas from the 1500s, from monogenism to polygenism. Eugenics passed anti-immigration laws based on race in 1924. Restrictive immigration trapped millions of people in Asia and Europe in genocidal regimes. Guys, there were also millions of Chinese people who were not allowed to immigrate to the United States when Japan invaded them. Hitler did exactly what Charles Davenport, Madison Grant, Harry Laughlin, and everyone else in the ERO tried to do. Grant promoted fascism, but he wasn't allowed to do it because the US was a democracy. But Adolf Hitler was. And this quote from Black, the author of the 2003 work War Against the Weak, really sums up this. So I'm going to read it to you. Quote, "The war against the weak had graduated from America's slogans, index cards, and surgical blades to Nazi decrees, ghettos, and gas chambers." End quote. In part 2, we will be studying the history of race and eugenics and white supremacy and U.S. immigration after World War II, from 1945 to the present day. And in this time period, eugenics fell from mainstream America as a popular science. It was condemned. Thank God it was. A war against the Nazis helped convince the US government and many Americans that eugenics was not the way. However, eugenics did not go away. Just like Charles Davenport and just like the ERO from 1945 to the present day, organizations are lobbying U.S. congressmen and women to pass legislation that promote eugenics. And that legislation is taking the form of immigration. So in part 2, we will be studying this phenomenon from 1945 to the present day. Thank you.